Good afternoon to you. I am Dr. Uja, and this is Democratic Studies PAT 403. This will be the fourth time this lecture is holding, and in all classes, messages have been sent out, sometimes even 3-4 hours before the lecture time. Same was done today. But to my greatest surprise, I think I am still alone online. However that may be, do well to watch the videos as they are uploaded on the site so that you would have a good idea of what we have been trying to discuss in this lecture. Also, do well to send in your questions and comments and contributions via the school website, or at best, you should add me up in your WhatsApp group. I think every class has a WhatsApp group that they use in informing others about lectures. The other classes that I lecture have a WhatsApp group. That is where we share very vital information in respect of the lecture schedule, and questions are also asked in those groups, and we do justice to them as they come up. So having said that, I'll give my number here so that you inform other members of the class about it. The number is 08036113243. Again, 08036113243. So I look forward to being added to your WhatsApp group so that we can all together decide on the timing of this lecture. That would do us a great deal of service. So having said that, we will continue from where we stopped. And in the usual way, I'll do a rundown of activities so far so that anytime you watch this video, you would know where you stand. So this is Democratic Studies, and it is a course that tends to expose us to what democracy is about, everything that concerns democracy, the features of democracy, and what you expect to see in a democratic system. And we began by giving a historical background of democracy from the Greek city-state and the earliest form of peace practice, where people gathered together to decide the affairs of their societies. However, we said modern day democracy, owing to its nature of complexity and the sophistication in modern day society, that aspect of gathering together to decide on the affairs of the state is no longer tenable. Hence the whole idea of representative government. And from there, we talked about the electoral system, we talked about political parties, and then we talked about the benefits that are inherent in the democratic system to the individual, because democracy in itself centers around the dignity and worth of the human person. And we said that the rule of law, fundamental human rights, and separation of power between organs of government are all embedded within the confines of the democratic system, and they together ensure that the society runs in favor of the masses. So in our last class, we discussed a little about constitutionalism and the electoral process in itself. And today we shall be looking at electoral reforms. We trace the whole idea of political parties and electoral reforms in Nigeria from the Clifford Constitution down to the Macpherson Constitution, Independence Constitution, to the modern day practice. And today we shall be looking at the reforms that have taken place in the electoral system in Nigeria. I will be sharing my screen with you at the moment so that you would be carried along in the discussions. We started by saying the electoral reforms in Nigeria. The problems confronting elections and electoral process in the nation's democratic history has been linked to behavioral, and attitudinal dispositions of the political elite. This is the view of Almond 2005. Part of the blame can also be placed at the doorstep of institutions that have been saddled with the responsibilities for the conduct of the elections. Remember, in the last class, we talked about the challenges that elections are faced with in Nigeria, where we talked about the issues of ballot box snatching, vote buying, rigging of elections in so many ways, and that to an extent, even people tend to now want to clamor for other forms of government other than democracy. And we gave examples of the earliest practices in Nigeria shortly after independence, where there were constant military intervention in politics. And the excuse for that was premised on the maladministration of democratic systems and institutions. And that, to a large extent, gave the impetus to the military and other people that have the coercive monopoly of the coercive use of force, or monopoly of coercion, as the case may be, to interfere in political underpinnings. So, due to the challenges that are inherent in the electoral system, as the earliest practices suggest, there was the need for reforms, for electoral reforms, to either update or upgrade the practices to cushion the negative effect of some of the maladministrations or the challenges that democratic institutions, political processes are faced with, to the ones where there is credibility and legitimacy accorded to the system. So the whole idea of reforms is premised on making adjustable moderations to suit contemporary demands and modern day democratic principles and practices. So the reforms that are taking place within the confines of the electoral system in Nigeria is what we shall be looking at today. Experiences have shown that rather than being independent of the executive and non-partisan, electoral commissions for the greater part of Nigeria's political history has been tied to the apron string of the incumbent executives. You see, we are now going into an in-depth view of what necessitates the issues of reforms within the electoral system. The normal practice in more advanced countries is a complete divorce of the electoral process from the executive arm of government, or even from the legislative arm of government. More like the electoral bodies are independent, and as such they perform their duties effectively and creditably, owing to the fact that they owe no one allegiance, or they are not answerable to the executive, and thereby being subjected to manipulations or undue influences, but they operate independent of these tiers of government. So what this idea of reform is talking about is in that direction, that electoral umpires or institutions should be independent of the executive and other forms of government, other arms of government, or other institutions of government, in such a way that they can discharge their duties effectively. Because if there's a saying that he who plays the music, who detects the piper plays the music, that if someone to a large extent decides what can happen around you, he will dictate the tone of your mode of operation, and that to a large extent would not augur well when one talks about democratic principles. So if they are not entirely tied to the dictates of the executive and they are largely independent, they tend to operate better. They do not only lack independence and transparency in their dealings with politicians and in the discharge of their functions, they are also far from being accountable and responsive to other stakeholders involved in the electoral process. So this is one of the challenges of the electoral system in Nigeria that necessitates the reforms that we are talking about today. That the Nigerian system, electoral system in Nigeria, it's not devoid of undue influences by the executive. And if you know the situation very well in Nigeria, you see that the head of the electoral body in Nigeria is often appointed by the executive. And if it's the executive that appoints the chairman of such an institution, it behoves on the chairman, or there's the moral burden that the chairman will definitely do the bidding of the executive. So the whole idea of reform, as known in advanced countries, is premised on the fact that electoral institutions are independent of the dictates of the government. And that is what we clamor for within the confines of democratic principles and practices within the Nigerian system. The history of election in Nigeria, in Nigeria's effort at democratization, has been an impressive one since independence. This is because electoral conduct in the nation's political history has been marred by fraudulent practices, corruption, and violence. It is therefore of little surprise that past efforts at democratization has collapsed at the altar of perverted elections and electoral processes. So bad was the situation that election periods has come to be associated with violence and politically motivated crisis. Politics has been converted into a money-making venture, has reinforced the notion of the elections as a contest that is meant to be won at whatever cost possible. So this is a characterization of the practice of elections within Nigeria before now, as we have been told now, that the INEC has done a lot of reforms that will be subjected to a field test going forward, and that these reforms would mitigate or stop the challenges of rigging and corruptions and electoral irregularities that hitherto was the practice in Nigeria. So the reforms looked basically at the efforts that have been put in place to check the crisis of maladministration in electoral arrangements in Nigeria. This has turned electoral conduct in Nigeria to a warlike situation. From the electoral commissions of Nigeria of the First Republic to the Independent National Electoral Commission of today, electoral commissions in Nigeria have not demonstrated the detachment, including competence, that are required in the discharge of their functions. Their inability to effectively manage the conduct and administration of elections and electoral process has consistently frustrated the nation's effort aimed at instituting a credible and viral democratic system. It is significant that on assumption of office, former President Musa Yar'Adua recognized the flaws, the flawed nature of the election that brought him into office. He therefore promised to set up a panel to review the electoral laws in Nigeria. This is still pointing to the fact that the electoral system in Nigeria is far from being perfect, right from the time of independence to the present day Independent National Electoral Commission, that the whole bodies that have been charged with conducting elections, free and fair and credible elections in Nigeria, have been faced with an array of challenges, and they have sought to impede or even call to question the legitimacy of some governments and the credibility of the processes that have brought them to power. And a good example was the statement made by Musa Yar'Adua when he came into power and recognized that the process that brought him to power was flawed, and hence he was determined to make reforms to put the system in the light of global best practices. And that was done to a large extent. Setting up of electoral reform panel headed by the former Chief Justice of Nigeria, Mohammed Wais. The Wise Committee made far-reaching recommendations that bordered on constitutional amendments, institutional strengthening, and value reorientation, including the granting of more autonomy to the Independent National Electoral Commission. This is contained in the Tell magazine of January 26, 2000, headed by the then Chief Justice Minister, Chief Ondaka. The Ondaka's panel tampered heavily with the recommendations of the Electoral Reforms Committee. For example, he submitted that the appointment of Chairman of the National Electoral Commission should not be made by the President. The whole idea in this embedded in this statement is premised on the efforts made to reform the electoral process in Nigeria by the then president and the subsequent adjustment made by the Attorney General of the Federation at that time. But the beauty of it all lay in the fact that it was targeted at giving a new posture and a new coloration to the practice of elections and democracy in Nigeria to accord it some measure of credibility and legitimacy by doing away with the challenges that were in existence as at then. The government in its white paper, which was out and came out with positions that were at variance with the aspiration of most Nigerians. The government's argument is that the involvement of the National Judicial Commission in the appointment of INEC chairman would violate the principle of separation of power. The National Assembly, however, rejected the proposed bill from the presidency. We sought to set up another commission that was to handle party registration. In the wise opinion of the lawmakers, that proposal was considered an unnecessary duplication of the functions of INEC and an unjustified waste of government resources. Accomplishing far-reaching electoral reforms for Nigeria is no doubt a major challenge that confronts the present administration in Nigeria. Obviously, in the 1999 elections, there were allegations of electoral manipulations. However, the scale was not as massive as that of 2003 or unavailingly sweeping as at that of 2007, 2011, and all the other elections after then until this very moment. So this very statement tends to reveal the extent of the efforts that were put in place to take away the wrongs that were embedded in the electoral system in Nigeria. And there were aspects of the reforms that the government embarked on to take away or to check the irregularities or the ill practices that were inherent features of our democratic practice. So what still, the manner the rerun governorship election in Ekiti State was conducted in April 2009 by INEC under Yaradua's watch shows that no lessons were learned by the politicians or remorse shown by the electoral umpire that had been severally indicted by the electoral tribunals, including the Supreme Court. You know, the experiment of democracy in Nigeria has been faced with an array of challenges, and it basically borders around the electoral processes. Elections before now, even though the present practice is still subject to some measure of scrutiny and fault finding here and there, it was far from what it is today. A lot of challenges ranging from inconclusive nature of elections to people being declared winners, even when the results shows a different narrative. So all those put together has been very challenging the practice of democracy in Nigeria. And that to a large extent necessitated the reforms that were called for. And one of such reforms was that the chairman of the Electoral Commission should be elected or should be appointed at the discretion of other bodies other than the executive. In other words, the president should not be the one to elect the chairman or the person in charge of elections in Nigeria, as that would, to a large extent, accord the person the free will to operate and to decide on how elections will be conducted without undue influence from the executive. So that was truncated by the National Assembly's position in that aspect, and we have had a lot of challenges. Like the 2015 election was marred with a lot of irregularities, as pointed out in the statement, where the results were called to question at different quotas, including from international organizations. However, efforts have been made by modern day government to improve on the practices to ensure that going forward, there would be some measure of credibility accorded to the electoral processes in Nigeria. And have been watching some measure of improvements from the recently concluded Osun election, other elections in Nigeria. So the continuous nullification of election results in many states of the Federation are confirmations that what passed for elections in 2007 and other reruns since 2008 were at best selections, or at worst charades, in spite of INEC's verdicts. Only the recently conducted governorship election in Anambra State on November 16, 2013 gives a ray of hope about future elections in Nigeria. There is no doubt the reason for the choice of Ghana as the first African country to be visited in July 2009 by the United States President Barack Obama. And it was a subtle indictment of Nigeria's electoral process. According to the United States, Ghana has now undergone a couple of successive elections in which power was transferred peacefully, even in a very close election. This statement is trying to make a comparative analysis of the practices in Ghana and Nigeria, and trying to accord some measure of improved system to the Ghanaian electoral system compared to the Nigeria's practice. And that's the United States of America's president visited Ghana as a way to further show that the electoral system in Ghana is freer and fairer than the practice in Nigeria. However, that is not a yardstick for measuring electoral credibility or the fairness of an electoral situation, as the institution itself and the reforms that the institutions are subjected to a large extent, is a better test of the free and fair nature of the electoral processes. So President Mills, Ghana's president, has shown commitment to the rule of law in the views of the United States president that visited Ghana. However, like I said earlier on, that is not a yardstick for measuring credibility in electoral practices or arrangements. So having said that, we shall be looking at the importance of the electoral reforms. And we say here that the importance of an efficient electoral system cannot be overemphasized in any democratic political system. A good electoral system delicately balances the politics of participation with the politics of representation, and ultimately contributes to the building of a viable and sustainable political culture. This statement is trying to show what one should expect from a good electoral system, or from the reforms that we claim to have put in place in the electoral system. And first, the issue of efficiency should be looked at. The issues of balancing politics of participation with politics of representation, and ultimately contributing to building a viable and sustainable political culture are all elements or aspects or attributes of which the reform agenda or the reform processes of the electoral body in Nigeria is charged with. The act of participation in the electoral process in a country not only vests legitimacy on the decision makers, it also makes the voters conscious that they are active and effective participants, though in an indirect sense, the decision-making process of their country. You see, this boils down to further buttress the point that we have been trying to make, that the beauty of a good electoral system is the fact that the leaders that are elected also demonstrate that they came in through the right process, and that the electorates also have the feeling of being involved in the process of deciding the affairs of their country. And that, to a large extent, is the beauty of democracy, or the beauty of a viable and credible electoral system. So the reform agenda that one expects is the type that would accord a lot of credibility to the system and improve the participation of individuals in the system and the choices that are made within the confines of the system. Because a good electoral process or a good electoral reform system, to a large extent, would reflect the popular will of the people, not this kind of boycott that we see, or the kind of irregularities that we witness within the earliest practices of elections and political participation within the confines of the Nigerian system. In a country where a good electoral system is in place, voting becomes much more than a ritual or a mechanical function, but an important instrument of citizen participation in the selection of their leader. So, in other words, because of the belief the people build in the electoral system, the reform agendas that are inherent in the system promotes participation and promotes the involvement of the people in the selection of their leaders. And that's to a large extent confers credibility and legitimacy on the system itself and on those that man the system. Having said that, it is worthy of note that after 5 decades of political independence and the fourth attempt at democratic government, Nigeria cannot be described yet as a stable political system. No country, including the advanced democracies, has yet devised a perfect process of electoral administration. What this is saying is that the earliest practices have not been entirely a reflection of what an ideal democratic process is about, especially as it concerns elections, on how representatives are chosen, and that there is much to be desired. And Nigeria, to a large extent, has not gotten to that point. But the good news is that there have been a lot put in place by successive governments and administrations of this country to improve on the credibility of the electoral process. And the 2023 election is going to be a test board to show that the reforms that have been carried out are viable and to a large extent are followed religiously. Leaders that will be picked in subsequent elections would be the true reflection of the desire of the people as the affairs of their states should be governed or administered. And let me pause here for a while to look at some of the reforms that have been made in the electoral system and that will be test run in the 2023 election. First is the automation of the voting procedure in its entirety, from the issues of capturing to the issues of accreditations to the issues of automatic transmission of election results from the polling units, unlike the earliest practices where it will be taken to the ward, to the local government, to the state, and across those lines, a lot of manipulations take place. So we have been told now that going forward, elections have been automated, and from the polling units where the votes are cast, the results are counted at the INEC headquarters in the electronic portal that they have created. And if that is actually the situation on ground, then the 2023 election holds a lot for Nigerians to benefit from and to increase the belief that they would have a system. But the difference between those countries and most developing states including Nigeria, is that they have some electoral procedure to an uninterrupted practice. And over the years, their electoral system have not only matured, but have also endured. It is for this reason that an electoral reform becomes the most significant step towards realizing the goal of free and fair election and sustainable democracy in the country. A closer look at the WISE panel report will reveal that it is a summary of the major problems confronting electoral administration in Nigeria, which include lack of capacity and shoddy preparation by the Electoral Commission, inadequate logistics, and irregular electoral outcomes that have severally been confirmed by the courts. What this is saying is that it tends to demonstrate what is expected of the reforms that have taken place in Nigeria before now. And then the emphasis is built around ensuring free and fair elections, and that the panels that were set up before now to improve on the electioneering processes in Nigeria have come up with an array of impediments that they consider have been the challenges with the electoral system. And the first that they've pinpointed is that it lacks capacity, and it lacks adequate preparation, and it lacks logistics, and irregular electoral outcomes have been the order of the day, owing to the fact that this institution have not operated optimally with the desired and required procedure for running a free and fair election system in Nigeria. However, efforts have been made to improve on the system, as have been seen in the various reforms that have taken place before now. While most of the election results have been upheld on ground of substantial compliance, this has not removed the odious stigma or lack of credibility or legitimacy on the beneficiaries of such controversial judicial decisions. This is trying to say that in as much as we have had leaders through these flawed processes or through these processes that Nigerians have called to question, it does not rule out the fact that they came into power through a flawed process and through a process that people are not entirely comfortable with, or that they do not conform to the best practices, global practices. However, we have had leaders through them, and then the best way to go about them is to ensure that these reforms are implemented and we continue to better the system in such a way that elections are now considered credible to a very large extent. Using the language of the system analysts, these electoral-related problems in Nigeria can be broadly categorized as system, process, and policy inadequacies, and we continue to haunt the conduct of elections in the country unless they are addressed at their roots. Let me go over that statement again. Using the language of system analysts, these electoral-related problems in Nigeria can be broadly categorized as system, process, and policy inadequacies. So the high point there are the categorization or the checklist of the challenges that the electoral process in Nigeria has been faced with. And then this view holds that the system in itself is flawed or marred with irregularities. The process itself is also another major challenge. And the policy guiding the system and the process is also characterized by a lot of inadequacies. And if not corrected, it will continue to haunt the practice of elections in Nigeria. However, like I said earlier on, the beauty of it all is that the system has been subjected to a lot of reforms, and we have seen an improved arrangement within the system. And then the experiments that we are going to be faced with will be the 2023 election, and to a large extent would either confirm that there have actually been reforms in the system, or still there are a lot to be desired. So, having said that, we still go further to say that, unfortunately, the attitude of the National Assembly towards electoral reform in Nigeria conveys the impression that the lawmakers are not enthusiastic about the reform system. So this is trying to point to some of the lacunas or some of the challenges that are inherent in the system. You know, because a lot of persons have benefited from the flawed processes, it is only natural for them to want to sustain it, so that it accords them the beauty of coming to power through flawed processes. Like before the Electoral Act was passed, we saw a lot of ups and downs in the procedure for it. A lot of persons not supporting the idea, but however, it came into existence at the discretion of the president, that if that is done, it would to a large extent improve on the practice or the conduct of elections in Nigeria, and the 2023 election would to a large extent be a test for the reforms that have taken place so far in terms of the automation of the electoral processes in Nigeria. According to late Ume Ezioke, the then All Nigerian People's Party's national chairman, the present political leadership in the country is loath and apprehensive of any constitutional review or electoral reforms, because as the major beneficiaries of the present unfair system, they are deliberately thwarting any move that may likely endanger their vested interest. Remember, that was what I said earlier on, that it is only normal for people to want to preserve a system that have brought them to power and turn a blind eye to the irregularities that are inherent in the system. Hence, they do everything to ensure that the reforms, the good aspects of the reforms are thrown out, and then the opposites are done, to ensure that in subsequent elections they can come in through the back door, as has always been the practice in Nigeria. But the beauty of it is that the present reforms that have taken place in the electoral system in Nigeria, or the electoral processes in Nigeria, is one that gives hope to the electorate that the desires of the people or the mandate of the people will not be cut short, but would rather be reflected in the system as we have been made to believe. And that to a large extent is an improvement in the electoral system in Nigeria. The legislator's attitude is a desire for self-preservation and to expect them to proceed in the urgent manner that most Nigerians desire is to make them embark on an exercise in self-destruction or immolation. What this is saying is that the National Assembly or the legislature to a large extent have not been okay with the whole idea of reforms that would lay bare the processes for transparency and accountability within the electoral procedure, because they know that if that is done, a lot of them that have benefited from the flawed system might not be in the system. Hence, the lackadaisical attitude to implement the reform advices and reforms agendas that have been brought up by reform committee on how to better the electoral procedure in Nigeria. The People's Democratic Party, the ruling party, as at 2015 in the country with a comfortable majority in the two houses of National Assembly and its control of more than 2/3 of the states in the Federation, has been identified as the biggest culprit in the conspiracy to frustrate the implementation of the recommendations of the Ways Panel report. Let me pause here to correct an impression or a situation. The material we are giving to lecture on, although I'm aware that improvements are being made, so sometimes I tend to go backwards a bit and even go above the scope of the material to carry you along or to give you a fair idea of the system and the changes that have taken place in the system. This earlier statement was talking about 2015, but we are in 2022. So the certain statements here might not be in tandem with the realities on ground. As of today, we have an APC government, but as of 2015, we had a PDP government. But however, certain elements stand out, and that has been the fact that the electoral process in Nigeria to a large extent has been called to question as to its credibility, as to its authenticity, as to its transparency and free and fair nature. All that have been called to question, owing to the fact that some persons have abused the system or have taken advantage of the pitfalls in the system to come to power through unacceptable means, and that reforms over time, over the years, have seen to correct some of those challenges. And we hope that going forward, there will be more credible, freer and fairer elections in Nigeria. One would also expect President Yar'Adua, with his well-publicized 7-point agenda, if he is willing to use his clout as the leader of the ruling party to push his party members to act swiftly without further delays in recommending the process of amending the relevant sections of the Constitution and the electoral laws. Apart from the Ways reports, there are many sources where the government can get inputs on the right thing to do. And one of such is on the February 23rd, 2010, the then former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, Mr. Walter Carrington, delivered a lecture titled Electoral Reform, Good Governance and Democracy, Lessons for Nigeria, where he stated that the enormous powers by the Independent National Electoral Commission were returned to democracy in 1999. Like I said earlier on, we have a new government, an APC government that have lasted for over 7 years now, and they have done a lot of reforms and a lot of improvements in the electoral system. And we have been told or made to believe that going forward, the procedure for elections in Nigeria will be freer and fairer and automated. And it has been tested in some elections in Nigeria, but the real test and experiment for it would be the deployment of these recommendations of the reforms and its implementation so far in the 2023 elections. And it is there that we would know if there is still much to be desired or if we have a near perfect system in Nigeria. He suggested that INEC should be a mostly administrative body to stem the controversy over elections in Nigeria. This was contained in The Guardian of February 24, 2010, that's the statement made by Walter Carrington, ambassador of the US to Nigeria. With all these interventions, the federal government cannot claim not to have sufficient proof that will make it take the much needed urgent step to carry out the reform of the electoral system in the country. Any further delay is about more than a year before the next election. So in summary, this unit takes a critical look at the importance of electoral reforms in details and concluded that regular reforms of the electoral system is a major prerequisite for a free and fair election in any given political system. And in conclusion, a country like Nigeria, where the electoral process is riddled with the disputes and rancor, will not only defeat the goal of achieving a sustainable democracy in Nigeria, it will also do a great deal of havoc to the country's image among the community of nations. So having said that, we have come to the end of the class, and a rundown of activities tends to show that the electoral process in Nigeria has been faced with an array of challenges and crises, and the reform procedures that have taken place over time is targeted at improving the system to ensure a freer and fairer electoral process and conduct of elections in Nigeria. And we have seen that a lot of recommendations have been made, ranging from the system itself to the processes and to the policies of government towards the conduct of election in Nigeria. And we have been made to understand also that with the passage of the new electoral bill and the automation that we have been told will be inherent in the practices henceforth from the polling units, in fact, from the point of accreditation of voters, it goes to a large extent to accord the procedure or the process some measure of legitimacy and transparency. And we have been made to believe that going forward, elections in Nigeria will be freer and fairer, and Nigerians will be proud of the system. So the whole idea of reforms in electoral systems is to ensure legitimacy and credibility through doing away with the processes that tend to be not to be in tandem with modern day practice, to those that reflects the popular will of the people. So the whole idea of reforms is to better the system. And having said that, the little self-assessment exercise that I will be giving here is that you should give reasons for the delay by National Assembly considering the report of the WISE panel on electoral reforms. So you do that and then try to read on your own and improve your knowledge of the system in its entirety. And like I said earlier on, do well to inform other members of the class, share my WhatsApp line, or add me in your WhatsApp group so that we can decide on when to have these lectures and gain the knowledge that we are supposed to gain from the system. So thank you for this time, and do well to inform other members of the class, like I have said, so as to carry everyone along. So thank you and enjoy the rest.